With daylight, we saw that there must have been about 10 tanks passing through without stopping, on their way to Kiev. However, our tension was so great that we stayed in the water for a long time, without moving, in spite of the stinking mud which had seeped into our helmets and through our hair, which was standing on end with terror. With absolute accuracy, the German guns, firing from the other side of the river, had drawn the Bolshevik tanks onto us, and contributed to the horrible deaths of many of our men. Cries for help drew us from our slimy refuge, and we ran to do what we could to help the dying, which was very little. We saw sights so horrible they were beyond any imagining. We shot a great many men to put them out of their misery, although mercy killings were strictly forbidden. At dawn the fog lifted, and an almost spring-like sun ushered in a new day of difficulties and disappointments. Burial squads were forcibly organized and began their grisly work, grimacing with horror. Everyone who managed to escape this duty went off as far as he could, to try to sleep or warm up. My partly dried clothes had gone stiff, and I felt uncomfortable and ill. But my exhaustion, which weighed on my eyes and made the sunlight unbearable, prevented me from grasping that I should have stripped and washed in the river, allowing the sun to nourish my exhausted body. I stayed as I was, immobilized by my need for sleep, staring through half-closed eyes at the damp grey-green of my uniform, turning slowly yellow as it dried. When I finally did sleep, I was awakened almost immediately by shouts of terror. I opened my eyes and stared up into an infinite pale blue sky, in which there was a familiar noise. Planes? My bones creaked as I propped myself up on one elbow. I couldn't see anything unusual, only the piles of sleeping bodies among the gorse. Everywhere, faces drowning in sleep were turning to the sky. A fellow in a fatigue cap ran by, shouting like a deaf man. A heavy machine gun behind me opened fire. It took us a while to shake off our torpor. 4 Russian planes were circling like hornets about 3,000 feet above us. Everyone was shouting, both men and officers. "Do you all want to be killed?" a ragged lieutenant was yelling at us. "You should at least try to defend yourselves." We feverishly grabbed our guns and waited with one knee on the ground for the enemy, who was about to drop from the clouds. However, the yaks went away. It was inconceivable that they should have been afraid of us, so we concluded they were running out of gas. We rubbed our eyes and sighed with relief, as our partially revived sense of vigilance died down. Everyone was thinking of stretching out again and catching up with his lost sleep. Then the heavy machine gun pivoted rapidly on its mount and began to fire toward the north. Everyone turned that way too, before throwing himself flat. The 4 planes roared over us almost at ground level, firing rapidly with all their guns. We could just hear the lieutenant, who was very near us, shouting as loud as he could to make himself heard above the noise of the planes. "Fire, you bastards!" The planes passed overhead. I saw the lieutenant roll onto the ground, stand up again, and with one hand clutching his stomach, fire his revolver at the roaring planes. Then he grimaced, fell to his knees, and rolled over onto himself. Of all the men around us, he was the only one who had been hit. The planes had reserved most of their fire for the overloaded, almost motionless rafts, which made perfect targets. "Give us some help!" shouted a fellow with a long, thin face, who'd gone with a companion to see what he could do for the lieutenant. Why in God's name did he stand up? "He was acting like a hero," answered one of the Felds, "and he was the only one. We should all be ashamed." The thin-faced fellow was helping to carry the dying man down to the river's edge. I was behind him with some of the lieutenant's things. "Shame has nothing to do with it," he said, sighing heavily. We had not been abandoned. From the west bank, our anti-aircraft guns were firing on the Russian vultures overhead, and the 2 ramshackle rafts on the river were continuing their dangerous journey. There must have been many dead and wounded men on board, to judge by the agitation we could all see. The planes dived down toward the swarming strip of ground, which rang with screams of pain and cries for help, and toward the rafts, and achieved a hideous massacre. Every time the danger withdrew for a moment, so that we could lift our heads and look out over the reeds, we saw scenes of tragedy. Almost everyone on the rafts who hadn't been killed or immobilized by wounds had jumped into the water and was trying to swim. The planes made a 4th pass, and were met this time by all our guns and Spandaus, which finally drove them away. We heard a loud sound of shooting. One of the Russian planes had been hit and was spiralling upward, trying to gain height, leaving a thick plume of black smoke behind it. Suddenly it lurched into an irrevocable dive toward the water. We saw a smaller shape detach from the mass of the plane, probably the pilot, trying to jump to safety. But his parachute, if he had one, failed to open. Man and machine hit the water at the same speed and disintegrated. For a moment, our cheers drowned the groans of the wounded on the rafts. However, toward noon, the Russian planes were back again, about a dozen fighter bombers this time. In the interval, we had deepened our holes so that we were better protected, but we couldn't reach the planes with our fire. The Russians, as before, attacked the heavily loaded rafts on the river, which had almost reached the west bank. Our flak tried unsuccessfully to keep the planes away, and we watched, pale with helpless rage, as the bombs fell toward the water. A raft and all its human cargo were blown to pieces. Our fleet was being liquidated, and the attacks were just beginning. The Ilyushins were gaining height to dive down again. A soldier beside me was weeping and shouting over and over, "The bastards! The bastards!" Our damp hands scraped nervously against the ground as we manoeuvred our guns. "We'll never get out of this," shouted my companion. "They'll wipe us out, the shits!" Then a miracle occurred, which completely changed the tone of our cries. "Sieg! Sieg! Der Luftwaffe!" 9 Messerschmitt 109F had appeared and were diving down onto the Russian planes, which had just completed an attack formation. The Russian pilots, aware of the technical inferiority of their planes, were trying to get away as fast as they could. We could hear bursts of fire and felt a surge of intense, savage and vengeful joy when we saw 2 of the Ilyushins spinning through the air like partridges hit by hunters' bullets. Then our cries grew even louder. 5 Russian planes passed right overhead before we realized they meant danger. We shook our fists at them. The fellow beside me, who'd been trembling with fury a moment before, was now trembling with joy, as uncontrolled as a madman. Our fighters were chasing the Ilyushins, which fled, skimming low over the ground. Then the pack disappeared behind the hills, which blocked our view. We heard guns and a loud explosion. After that, we had nothing to do but tend the wounded. The next day, we felt almost happy to wake in the rain. Traffic across the river had continued all night, carrying over as many men as possible. Nevertheless, a vast number were still waiting on the east bank. We no longer knew how many days we'd been there, but despite all our difficulties, we'd been able to reorganize somewhat. Men belonging to the same units had sorted each other out and waited in distinct groups. Our officers had posted armed men on the hills to warn against a sudden attack. We knew that the Russians were very close and felt rather surprised that they hadn't attacked already. Probably the battle for Kiev had absorbed almost all of them. I had joined a large group of men made up for the most part of members of the Gross Deutschland, and men who had escaped from the infantry regiment which had come to our aid when we broke through at Konotop. The officers present, among whom I was delighted to see Herr Hauptmann Wessreidau, told us that as members of an elite division and as specialized offensive troops, we should have been among the first to embark for the West. They also said that we would be the next to go. Naturally, we were glad to hear it, as everyone wished to reach the West Bank as quickly as possible. Some fellows suggested a technique that had occurred to many of us as soon as we arrived at the river. This was to tie together bunches of reeds with our belts and use them as floats. This had been proved successful many times, but it was not possible for moving the equipment indispensable to any soldier who did not wish to be considered a deserter. The reception of these unequipped men on the other bank must have been sufficiently poor for our officers to forbid escape by reed float, but it was difficult for them to impose discipline on men simultaneously paralyzed by fear and prepared to affront the devil. Many men, in fact, drowned or died of pneumonia, and many, after risking everything, were court-martialed. I no longer had any clear idea of our situation, and set about trying to discover from the soldiers in my unit what had happened to my friends. Perhaps someone among these 3,000 men waiting in the mud had run into Hals or Lenzen or the veteran, stretched out on an armful of long, soaking stalks, dreaming of a distant utopia, indifferent to the rain running down his resigned features. But my researches were in vain, and my questions remained unanswered. Once I thought I recognized a couple of faces from our disbanded company. I talked to the fellows, who answered evasively that they no longer remembered anything that had happened. They were absolutely exhausted, and my questions only seemed to annoy them. Their stunned minds seemed capable of only one idea. They had to cross the river. There was only one person who might know a little more than the others, Herr Kapitän Vesreidau. But the respect and fear which officers required of us made it almost impossible to speak to them. A few of the older soldiers were bold enough to approach them, but for a boy like myself it was entirely different. However, I was so consumed by desire to speak to the captain that it must have showed on my face. Also, I was always lingering somewhere near him or his group. I was sitting on my bundle a short distance away from Vesreidau and 2 or 3 other officers, including a major, when Vesreidau began to walk toward me. I stared in confusion at the tall figure in the long leather coat shining with rain, ready to leap to my feet and snap to attention. But the captain gestured to me to stay as I was, so I remained on the ground, with my eyes glued to his face. He seemed even taller than usual, because I was so low down. "What regiment do you belong to, young fellow?" he asked. I stammered out my regimental number, as well as the number of the scratch company I was taken into for the retreat from Konotop. He took me for a check, so I explained my origins to him. Was all he said about that. Those scratch companies were the last ones out. I led several of them myself. "I know, Herr Hauptmann," I said, blushing. "I saw you." I couldn't get used to the idea that the captain really was talking to me. "Ah," said Vesreidau. "Then we have memories in common of a difficult time." "Ja, Herr Hauptmann." He reached for a cigarette, but the packet was empty. Had he perhaps been going to offer me one? "We'll be crossing tomorrow, young fellow, and I expect you'll be getting a long leave." The word leave was like a sudden sip of champagne. "Leave!" "I think so. We won't have stolen it from you." Sensations which I had thought I would never feel again immediately revived. All the emotions I had buried with so much difficulty. Could it be possible? But it had always been possible. How could I doubt it? I suddenly realized the full weight of my despair, how absolutely I had given up hope. Now I began to think again, timidly and gently, of Paula. Since we had been organized into the special assault group, there had been no mail. Although we had been moving continuously, this lack of news had weighed on me terribly. And then, in the face of such intense misery and disgust, words describing love and tenderness lost their meaning. Everything I had felt seemed to have been swept away in the dust and noise of crumbling houses, and in misery far more intense than the miseries of love. I had often thought that if I managed to live through the war, I wouldn't expect too much of life. How could one resent disappointment in love if life itself was constantly in doubt? Since Belgorod, terror had overturned all my preconceptions, and the pace of life had been so intense one no longer knew what elements of ordinary life to abandon in order to maintain some semblance of balance. I was still unresigned to the idea of death, but I had already sworn to myself during moments of intense fear that I would exchange anything, fortune, love, even a limb, if I could simply survive. I sensed that Captain Vesreidau was about to leave, so I asked him if he knew anything of my usual companions. He was only able to remember the veteran, calling him by his proper name. August Wiener's company was supporting a howitzer battery at the beginning of the offensive. The first troops had a hard time. It was very difficult. In any case, the men who got through were probably sent to Kiev. That's where we would have regrouped if we'd had the trucks. I listened to him in silence. He nodded and walked away. "We'll be crossing tomorrow." My head was spinning with the thought of a leave, and with the anguish of the possible loss of my special comrades. Perhaps I had already walked past their burnt bodies on the shattered pavement of the Konotop-Kiev road. Would I also have to renounce the friendships which had seen me through so much? I knew that they also were so close to being stripped of everything that the sentiment I had for them seemed permissible. It was so gratuitous and disinterested. Must I also obliterate without remorse? For remorse is a dangerous luxury in battle. the memories of Hals and Lenson, and even that bastard Lindbergh. However, if my friends had disappeared, the veteran had left me an inheritance, a special faculty. I would relive all my good memories, even in the worst moments, and lie on the ground, inert and almost insensible, oblivious of the rain which my saturated cap was no longer able to soak up, and which ran over my face and collar and down my neck. The rain streaming across my cheeks would take the place of the tears I should have shed. The rain continued for a long time, through the night and the next day, until the end of the afternoon. The soil on which we waited had become a giant sponge. Each fresh bundle of rushes soaked up as much water from the ground as it received from the sky. We were so thoroughly soaked through that some of us stripped altogether to wait naked. Most of the time we stayed on our feet, with tent cloths over our shoulders, watching the endless back and forth of the rafts. Toward noon, despite the terrible weather, a squadron of Ilyushins appeared. Once again we cursed those birds of ill omen, which forced us to lie with our noses in the gluey Dnieper mud. The planes made 3 passes, scattering bombs and bullets wherever they could see anything. Once again, we were filled with a panic, which ended only when the list of killed and wounded had grown a little longer. Finally, towards 6 in the evening, as the light was fading, our group was taken in charge by the transit services. We were ordered to collect our things and proceed in good order to the 3 embarkation points, which the incessant trampling had transformed into an astonishing quagmire. Carrying our arms and baggage covered with slimy mire, we set off down the road despite the mud which threatened to engulf us. With heroic patience and discipline, each man waited his turn, enduring the torrential rain without complaint. With our feet in the muddy water our boots could no longer resist. We kept our assigned places. The last men to embark had to wait for several hours. Vague, momentary smiles lit our almost unrecognizable faces. At last we were going to cross, and all of this would be over. We would be able to dry ourselves and sleep, perhaps even in comfort, and stop feeling afraid. We clung to our more hopeful thoughts, although we were haunted by one last fear. What would happen on the trip across? Would the overused, overloaded boats make it? Or would they sink, carrying 100 desperate souls to the bottom? And then there were the Yarbos. If any Russian planes appeared, we could all remember in clear detail the horrible massacre of the day before. Then it grew dark. Russian planes rarely flew at night, so perhaps we were at least safe from them. When it was my turn, I climbed with 100 other men onto a raft whose planks had been splintered by the passage of thousands of hobnailed boots. I watched anxiously as the water rose to within a foot of swamping us. "That's enough, Captain," shouted a non-com who looked about 40 years old. "Do you want us to sink?" "As many as possible, Herr Spieß," an engineer said, laughing. "That's orders and we're used to it. Come on, let's have another 10. When we were on the point of foundering, the boatmen let go of the ropes and, with the agility of young goats, jumped onto the few inches they had reserved for themselves. So slowly we were almost unaware of it, the raft began to move out onto the water, which was barely creased by our momentum. Our balance seemed so precarious that no one dared move. The cursed bank, veiled in fog, disappeared from sight. I was huddled in the centre of the raft between 2 fellows I didn't know, a young lieutenant from an infantry regiment which had come to help us at Konotop, and a fellow from my own company, who seemed to be asleep on his feet. He was the only one who seemed so indifferent. Everyone else was listening and looking intently, especially toward the rainy sky, which we mistrusted absolutely. A boat half the size of ours, but with the same engine, slowly pulled level with us. Its deck was as jammed as ours. How long was the crossing? Perhaps a quarter of an hour. It seemed interminable. The water slid past us with an easy, regular motion, whose slowness made us frantic. Some of the fellows were counting aloud, marking off the seconds perhaps, or using them as one uses imaginary sheep to force sleep. Then voices announced the approach of the west bank and safety and release from our torments. The men at the front of the raft could see it, enveloped in fog. Our blood ran faster in our veins as we tried, by willpower, to increase the speed of the engine. We were about to land, to be safe quick, while the sky was still quiet. An empty raft crossed our path, heading back for the east bank. We looked at it coldly. Any movement toward the east made us shiver. Then the West Bank was only 20 yards away. We no longer dared to move for fear of foundering, despite an intense joy which we would have expressed in other circumstances by jumping and shouting. After so many days and hours of waiting and despair, we had been saved. Then there were only 10 yards, then 5. The engines went into reverse to slow us down. We drew up beside a pier made of tied branches, and we heard voices telling us to move slowly and carefully. With a sense of enormous privilege, we stepped one after the other onto the solid earth, which is to say onto a quagmire exactly like the East Bank, but the mud no longer mattered. We had crossed to the other side. The West Bank meant security and safety, a barrier between us and the Russians. We had dreamed of this safety for so long and so intensely that we almost felt as if there were a barrier between us and the war itself. The bulletins had been official. We would hold on to the Dnieper. The enemy would not pass beyond that line, and in the spring we would push them back beyond the Volga. During our long and painful retreat to the river and our endless wait, our thoughts had crystallized around this idea, and actually stepping onto the West Bank seemed like the end of our misfortune. Reorganization, clean clothes, leave, and the assurance that we had not been beaten. Of course, the West Bank was still Russia, but it was the part of Russia which had welcomed us a few years earlier, the part of Russia which really favoured us. Our exhausted brains clung to this fantasy. The West Bank was almost the motherland. The officers and soldiers waiting to direct us were not particularly agreeable, and the military police, with their badges glistening damply in the fog, were downright unpleasant. All organisations have police, and some of them must be fine fellows. However, we wanted to forget the police at Romney, and on the retreat from the Don, to preserve some of the joy we felt at being back in the West. We tramped along, herded by a couple of fellows in a sidecar covered with mud. They didn't bother to line us up in threes, but let us walk any way we liked, almost as if we were out for a stroll, which was a pleasant variation of usual practice. Maybe they knew what a hard time we'd had, and had decided to give us a break. Now that we were out of it, maybe everything was going to be all right. The sidecar forced us to increase our pace. We went on for about 1.5 miles, stumbling through the mud and splattering our companions, to arrive finally at a big camp, where the men who'd crossed ahead of us were already waiting. It was dark and a fine rain was falling. We could see the barbed wire gleaming with wetness. 2 soldiers with machine guns under their arms waved us through a makeshift entrance. Then we stopped, and the sidecar drove rapidly away. We stood where we'd been left, surrounded by barbed wire, not knowing what to think. We tried to tell ourselves that this was just how things happened in the army, and that this welcome seemed excessively cold because we were fresh from the hell of Konotop. They were probably making us wait so that they could take us straight to clean, comfortable barracks, where we would sleep and regain our strength. Or perhaps they were getting our passes ready. This last idea filled us with joy and annihilated the liquid mud and the rain and the barbed wire, which in reality held us prisoner. We waited for about 2 hours. A second group of new arrivals joined us. The rain had become heavier, and we were all streaming with water. Quite nearby, we could see a row of huts with firm roofs and weathertight windows, to which men were being sent in groups of 20. We waited expectantly, certain that we were living through the last of our miseries. The fellows who went into the huts weren't coming out again. They must already be sleeping on soft beds, the lucky bastards. An hour later, it was my turn, along with 19 others. There were 2 non-coms and a lieutenant in our group. We went into the building, which had its own generator and was brightly lit. Our state of extreme filth suddenly made us feel awkward. Military men of all ranks and military police were sitting facing us behind a row of long tables. An Obergefreiter came up to us, yelling as in the old days at training camp. He told us to get over to the tables to be screened. We should be ready to produce on demand the papers and equipment entrusted to us by the army. This reception only increased our sense of astonished unease. "First, your documents!" an MP shouted across the table. The lieutenant, who was directly ahead of me in the line, was being interrogated. "Where is your unit, Lieutenant?" Annihilated, Herr Gendarme, missing or dead. We had a hard time. The MP said nothing to this, but went on leafing through the lieutenant's papers. Did you leave your men, or were they killed? The lieutenant hesitated for a moment. We were all watching in frozen silence. Is this a court-martial? The lieutenant's voice was exasperated. You must answer my questions, Herr Lieutenant. Where is your unit? The lieutenant clearly felt caught in a trap, as did we all. Very few of us could have answered that question with any precision. He tried to explain, but there is never any point in explaining to an MP. Their powers of comprehension are always limited to the form they wish to fill. Further, it appeared that the lieutenant was missing a great many things. This fact obsessed his interrogator. It didn't matter that the man in front of him was effecting a miracle simply by staying on his feet and had lost at least 30 pounds since entering the army. The MP only noted that the Zeiss field glasses, which are part of an officer's equipment, were missing. Also missing were a map case and the section telephone for which the lieutenant was responsible. In fact, the lieutenant, who had managed to save only his life, was missing far too many things. The army did not distribute its papers and equipment, only to have them scattered and lost. A German soldier is expected to die rather than indulge in carelessness with army property. The careless lieutenant was assigned to a penal battalion, and 3 grades were stripped from his rank. At that, he could think himself lucky. The lieutenant's eyes were wild, and he seemed to be fighting for breath. He was a pitiful and terrifying sight. 2 soldiers dragged him off to the right, toward a group of broken men who'd been dealt with in the same way. Then it was my turn. I felt stiff with fright. I pulled my crumpled documents from an inside pocket. The MP riffled through them, throwing me a reproving look. His bad temper seemed to soften somewhat at the sight of my apprehensive, mortified face, and he continued his inventory in silence. Fortunately, I had been able to reintegrate with my unit and had saved the scrap of white cardboard which stated that I had left the infirmary to take part in an attack. My head was swimming, and I thought I was going to faint. Then the MP read off a list of articles which ordinary soldiers like myself were supposed to carry at all times. The words rolled off his tongue, but I didn't catch them quickly enough, and didn't immediately produce the items still in my possession. The MP then treated me to a certain German word, which I was hearing for the first time. It appeared I was missing 4 items, including that fucking gas mask I had deliberately abandoned. My paybook was passed from hand to hand to be inspected and stamped. In my panic, I made an idiotic move. Hoping to gain favour, I produced 9 unused cartridges from my cartridge belt. The MP, our eyes lit on these like the eyes of an alpinist who spots a good foothold. You were retreating? Ja, Herr Unteroffizier. Why didn't you try to defend yourself? Why didn't you fight? He shouted. Ja, Herr Unteroffizier. What do you mean, ja? We were ordered to retreat, Herr Unteroffizier. God damn it to hell, he roared. What kind of an army runs without shooting? My paybook came down the line. My interrogator grabbed it and riffled the pages for a moment. His eyes travelled from the filthy, tattered page to my face. I followed the movement of his lips, which might be about to assign me a penal battalion to the life of a prisoner, to forward positions, mine clearing, infrequent leaves always confined to camp, so that the word liberty lost all meaning, and the cancellation of mail. I held back my tears with difficulty. Finally, the MP, rigid fingers handed back my liberty. I had not been assigned to a penal battalion, but my emotion overwhelmed me anyway. As I picked up my pack, I sobbed convulsively, unable to stop. A fellow beside me was doing the same. The crowd of men still waiting stared at me in astonishment. Like a miserable tramp, I ran past the line of tables and left by a door opposite the one we'd entered by. I felt that I had disgraced myself. I rejoined my comrades, who were standing in the rain in the other part of the camp. They weren't resting on the soft beds we'd dreamed of before coming to this place, and the rain streaming down their shoulders and backs was another hope disappointed. However, despite the slap in the face we had just received from our grateful country, we could still count ourselves lucky. 3 days later, we learned that the day after our crossing, with 6,000 or 7,000 of our men still waiting on the east bank, the Russians had attacked. They were probably discouraged by their failure to retake Kiev, where the heavily outnumbered German army was fighting desperately, and had decided to clean up the pockets still occupied by the Wehrmacht. 24 hours after our group left, our comrades on the east bank were suddenly dazzled by the flares that flooded their temporary encampments with brilliant light. The lookouts in the shallow trenches scratched into the hills overlooking the river, who were supposed to provide an illusion of protection, watched the shouting hordes of Russian infantry flood down to the river. These soldiers quickly realized they would never be able to stop that irresistible tide, and succumbed to a moment of absolute panic. Some ran through the deafening explosions of Soviet rockets which drowned out our Spandaus and light mortars. The Russians, driven by expectations of victory and by the exhortations of the People's Commissars, pushed forward regardless of the cost. The cost was enormous. Each German projectile seemed to hit home, but Ivan continued his inexorable advance. On the mud landing stage from which I had embarked, panic gave way to madness. One of the rafts, which was loading up as usual, was swamped by a human flood. The few who managed to keep cool heads shouted for calm, and sometimes even used their guns. In the grotesque trampling rush, mooring ropes gave way, and the raft drifted out a few yards, shuddering under the weight of the mob which had overrun it. Hands trying to grip the edges of the raft were trampled and crushed by heavy boots. On the landing stage, friends were fighting each other. Some of the officers committed suicide. The raft moved out another couple of yards, and then suddenly tipped away from the bank like a child's toy. A loud cry mingled with the sound of the approaching battle, and 200 terrified men floundered in the water, clinging together or trying to swim. A great many sank and drowned instantly. At that moment, Ivan appeared at the crest of the hills, having swept the defenders aside. Drunk with excitement, the Russian soldiers dropped to the ground on one knee and picked off Germans as if they were clay pigeons at a fair. A few Germans, white as ghosts, fired back with their FM, but their numbers were so small the Russians scarcely noticed them. Several thousand others were running, screaming, trying to get away, and dying as they ran. The Russians also fired at the men in the water who were trying to swim, using flares to light the darkness. An hour after they had appeared on the skyline, the Russians reached the river. There were a few more scattered shots, but their victory was complete. A third of the remaining German troops were taken prisoner, and for the rest everything was over. Their military responsibilities had come to an end, and they would never again be victimized by military police. At the reception camp, we stood in the rain a little longer, and then 3 blacked-out trucks appeared to collect us. Despite the appalling road and the overload which threatened to burst the slatted sides, 50 soldiers wrapped in sacking were piled onto each truck with all their equipment. I was stuffed into one of these human ant heaps. That is to say, one leg was buried in the swarm, while the other dangled out. I was astride the back flap, but there were other fellows hanging on for dear life, who were almost entirely outside the truck. We rolled off through the quiet night. I felt completely disoriented, and hadn't the faintest sense of our direction. An hour later, we drew up to a group of buildings, which first appeared as a vague, blurred mass in the dim, bluish light. We realized that an unusual rush of activity was taking place all around, and then gradually perceived that we were looking at a row of structures bordered on both sides by tree-lined roads jammed with innumerable vehicles. There were troops everywhere, on foot or arriving and leaving on high-speed motorcycles, and many officers and MPs. The trucks jerked to a sudden halt, and we were told to get off. Although we still understood that we'd been saved, we were beginning to feel that we'd had enough. We were famished and dropping with sleep. We had to wait for another half hour before someone came to take charge of us. The rain fell steadily. Was it raining anywhere else? Was it raining in France? I tried to think of my house and my bed. Where were they now? In which direction? But I could only summon up confused and fragmented memories of the life I had left behind. My only world was the vast anonymity of Russia, which seemed to be engulfing all of us, absorbing entire regiments, so that even their names vanished. Finally, a non-com came over to us. Our group leader handed him our papers, which he examined with a dimmed flashlight. Then he ordered us to collect our gear and follow him. At last we entered the shelter of a roof, an amenity to which we'd grown so unaccustomed that we stared at it as if it were the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. "You'll be sent to your units later," shouted the non-com, who, like the rest of us, seemed to have had just about enough. "While you're waiting, try to get a little rest." He didn't have to repeat himself. We explored the darkness of the butt with our pocket flashlights and discovered that it contained a couple of benches and 4 or 5 large tables. Everyone stretched out where he could, making pillows of the nearest leg, or buttocks, or boot. The discomfort seemed unimportant beside the fact that at last we were out of the rain. Some fellows began to snore immediately. Others tried to pretend they were somewhere else. Despite our harsh reception, we all had a sense that from now on everything would go better, and that once again life was offering its possibilities. We all thought of the leave we would surely be getting, which was now only a question of patience. However, soldiers fresh from the front cannot indulge the luxury of daydreams. The accumulated lack of sleep gripped our temples like an iron band. Like people suffering a serious illness, we dropped swiftly from consciousness into deep sleep. We probably slept for a long time. It was broad daylight when a burst of noise suddenly woke us. Then a long blast of a whistle ordered us to our feet. We were all filthy and horribly crumpled. If the Führer had seen us, he would either have sent us all home or had us shot. The non-com who had waked us looked at us with an expression of surprise. Perhaps he too had never imagined that the German army could be reduced to such a state. He spoke to us, but I no longer remember what he said. I was still only half awake and understood that he was talking without really listening to him. We gathered that we were to prepare for departure. We were going to be returned to our units. One of the huts had been fitted with showers, but so many men were waiting that we clearly had no chance of getting inside. Instead, we were given some empty gasoline vats full of hot water. However, we all felt too exhausted to want to wash. Our days of training, when we were appalled by the smallest spot on our tunics, seemed very far away. Our concern had shifted from hygiene to something far more urgent. Furthermore, it was bitterly cold, and no one wanted to take anything off, not even the sacking draped over our shoulders. I was so cold I was shivering, and I wondered if I was getting sick again. We had to go outside for food, and lined up like a column of tramps beside the field kitchen. A cold east wind was blowing damp patches of fog in from the river. 2 cooks emptied large ladles of hot soup into our chipped and filthy mess tins. We had been expecting the usual ersatz, but it seemed that the time for that had long gone by. As a special gesture, they were serving us 11 o'clock soup early. The burning hot mixture made us feel much better. Our Hauptmann stared at us as he walked by and then turned back, obviously looking for our unit leader. The lieutenant who filled this position got up and walked over to him. "Kamerad," the captain said, "you and your men have been given this opportunity to clean up. I think you should make the most of it." "Jawohl, Herr Hauptmann." The lieutenant ordered us over to the vats, which were standing under the eaves of one of the huts. We looked enviously across at the fellows who were going to get into hot showers. At least 300 men were waiting for an experience which seemed like a blessing from heaven, so close to the front. Those at the front of the line had more or less undressed and were scratching the lice which had settled in a ring at the belt line, when we were suddenly ordered to prepare for immediate departure. For me, at least, this was a reprieve. Stripping in that icy air had begun to seem impossibly difficult. I much preferred to keep my lice relatively warm between my grey undervest and my stomach, which was rumbling with hunger. I was certainly ill again. I no longer had any doubts. I couldn't stop shivering, and felt cold right down to the soles of my feet. We piled into the open trucks, overloading them as usual. But no one complained. No matter how squashed we were, it was better than walking. However, I was soon caught in a grotesque predicament. The trucks rolled off down a road which the rains had transformed into a swamp. The truck behind us gave off 2 sprays of liquid mud, as steady and uniform as the sprays of a municipal fountain. I was strangely reminded of the retreat from the Don. Was Russia nothing but a vast sea of mud? As always, we were driving toward a northern horizon marked by dark forests. The echoes of occasional explosions drifted to us on the wind, but they didn't sound serious. The sky was overcast and threatened rain. Huddled between two companions, I swayed to the slow rhythm of the trucks, struggling through the mire. I felt more and more uncomfortable and ill. My lips and face seemed to be burning, and the slightest motion of the air felt like ice against my skin. My stomach was griped by a brutal pain, which travelled outward through my body, in waves of violent shivers. At first I thought this must be an after-effect of the hard times we'd been through, especially as I had never entirely recovered from my illness at Konotop. I knew that I must look more cadaverous than ever. My intestines were twisting themselves in knots. Naturally, no one gave a damn, and besides, I was certainly not the only one with a pain in my gut. Then my pain became so imperative that I tried to double over, despite the crowding and all my gear. The fellow beside me noticed my restlessness and leaned his hairy face toward me. "Take it easy, friend. We'll soon be there." But he clearly had no more idea where we were going than I did. "I've got a hell of a pain in the gut. And this is a hell of a time to crap." Suddenly, I realized what was the matter with me. My stomach was churning with increasing violence and threatened to explode. I certainly couldn't stop a military convoy because my guts were about to turn inside out. I had to laugh at my predicament, despite my shivers and cramps and salivating mouth. But I also had to try to think of a solution. The convoy was now in the middle of a forest, where there was no reason to stop. And even if we came to a camp, I couldn't just leave my group the moment we arrived, without any apparent motive. If I did that, they might even shoot me as a deserter. But could I hold out much longer? I tried desperately to think of something else, but failed. My pains increased, and I broke out in gooseflesh. Finally, my gut simply opened. "Move over a little, fellow," I said, grimacing. "I've got terrible diarrhea, and I can't wait any more." The truck was making a lot of noise, and no one seemed to hear me. I shoved with my elbows and shouted louder. The fellows on either side of me moved back about 4 inches, but paid no further attention. I could feel myself blushing with embarrassment. I tried to undo my clothes, jostling one of my neighbours. "What's the hurry?" he said. "You'll be able to crap when we get there." "But I'm sick, damn it." He muttered something and moved one of his feet, although there was really nowhere to put it. No one laughed. In fact, everybody seemed entirely indifferent to my plight. I struggled desperately with my clothes, but in the cramped space, encumbered with all my equipment, I was unable to free the lower half of my body. Finally, I realized there was nothing I could do. My bowels emptied, pouring a stream of vile liquid down my legs. No one seemed even to notice my condition, which left me in a state of indescribable misery. My stomach was knotted with pain, and I collapsed into a stupefied torpor, which prevented me from appreciating the ridiculous aspects of my situation. In fact, the situation was not particularly funny. I was really seriously ill, and my head was spinning and burning with fever. This was the first attack of a chronic dysentery which has plagued me ever since. Our journey continued for a considerable time, during which I suffered 2 further attacks of uncontrollable diarrhea. Although my state of filth was scarcely aggravated by these eruptions, I would gladly have exchanged 10 years of my life for a chance to clean off and fall asleep in a warm bed. I was shaken by alternate fits of shivers and burning heat, and the pain in my intestines grew more and more intense. After what seemed like an eternity, we arrived at our new camp, and I was dragged from the truck for roll call. My head was swimming, but although fainting would have guaranteed the quickest route to the infirmary, I struggled to remain conscious. Somehow I managed to stay upright among my comrades, each preoccupied with his own fate. However, my ghastly appearance did not escape the attention of the inspecting officer, and my gasping replies to his questions interrupted the regular rhythm of roll call. "What's the matter with you?" he asked. "I'm sick. I was barely able to stammer a reply, and saw him only as a blurred and shifting silhouette. "What's bothering you?" "My stomach. I have a fever. Could I please go and wash, Herr?" "Take him to the medical service as an urgent case," continued the officer, speaking to a subordinate. The latter stepped forward and took me by the arm. Someone was actually trying to help me. I could hardly believe it. "I've got acute diarrhea, And I have to clean off, I groaned as we tottered off. You'll find everything you need in the sanitary block, camarade. At the infirmary, I stood in line behind some 30 other men. The pains in my abdomen tore at my entrails with an intensity which made me scream. I knew that my gut was about to pour out some more filth. I staggered from the line, trying to make my step firm, and followed the signs to the latrine. When that series of intestinal explosions was finished, I hesitated before pulling up my revolting trousers. Although I was in an incredible state of filth, I noticed that my excrement was streaked with blood. I went back to the infirmary to stand in line for another half hour. Then my turn came. One after the other, I peeled off my nauseating rags. "My God, what a stink!" exclaimed one of the orderlies, whose outlook was probably identical with that of the motto over the gate of our training camp. "Ein Laus, der Tod." I looked at the long table where members of the sanitary service were sitting like judges. The only plea I could possibly make was guilty. "Dysenteric diarrhea," muttered one of the judges, obviously shocked by the shit which ran down below my knees. "Get to the showers, you pig," the other said. "We'll look at you when you're clean." There's nothing I'd like better. You don't know how long I've been dreaming of a shower. "Right over that way," said the first fellow, who was clearly anxious to be rid of me. I threw my coat over my bony shoulders and went across to the showers. Luckily, no one was there but a bewildered-looking boy who was scrubbing the floor. "Any hot water in the showers?" "Do you want hot water?" His voice was gentle and friendly. "Do you have any?" "Yes, 2 big vats for 16th Company laundry. I could let you have some, though. The showers only run cold." Through my fever, I saw him as another bastard who'd do a favour for cigarettes or something else. "I don't have any cigarettes." "That doesn't matter. I don't smoke." I stood where I was, considerably surprised. "Well then, could you do it right away?" But the fellow was already hurrying off. "Go in there," he said, pointing over his shoulder to an open cubicle. "You'll be more comfortable." 2 minutes later, he was back, carrying 2 buckets of steaming water. "Were you at the front?" he asked. I looked at him, wondering what he was trying to find out. He was still smiling his foolish smile. "Yes, and I've had enough of it too, if you want to know. I'm sick and disgusted." "It must be terrible. Feldwebel Hulf says that pretty soon now he'll be sending me off to get killed." I went on with the extraordinary relief of washing off my backside, but looked up at him with some surprise. There are always fellows like that who enjoy sending other fellows out to get it in the neck. "What do you do?" "I was called up 3 months ago. I left Herr Fechter, and after basic training in Poland was enrolled in the Großdeutschland." That's a familiar story, I thought to myself. Who's Herr Fechter? "My boss. A little strict, but nice anyway. I've worked for him since I was a kid." "Your parents sent you out so young?" "I don't have any parents. Herr Fechter took me straight from the orphanage. There's a lot of work on his farm." I stared at him. Someone else whose luck had been a little thin. He was still smiling. I clutched my stomach, which once again felt as if it might explode. "What's your name?" "Frosch. Helmut Frosch." "Thank you, Frosch. Now I must try to get into the infirmary." I was preparing to leave when I noticed a short, thick-set figure standing in the doorway watching us. Before I could say a word, the man shouted, "Frosch!" Frosch spun around and ran back to the wet rag he'd left on the floor. I went out slowly, trying to pass by unnoticed. But the Feldwebel in any case was concentrating on Frosch. "Frosch! You left your work. Why?" "I was only asking him about the war, Sergeant." "You were forbidden to talk during punishment fatigue, Frosch, except to answer my questions." Frosch was about to reply when a sonorous whack cut him short. I looked back. The Feld's hand, which had just given it to Frosch full in the face, was still raised. I took myself off as fast as I could, as a torrent of abuse poured over my unfortunate companion. "Bastard!" I shouted silently at the Feld. At the sanitary service, the aide looked at me without enthusiasm. I understood immediately that he was one of these fastidious fellows, for whom a day of filthy scarecrows like myself was less than a pleasure, especially as he received no fees to encourage civility. He fingered all my parts, poking me a little all over, and concluded his examination by sticking his finger into my mouth to check the condition of my teeth. Then he added a string of numbers and letters to a card clipped to my papers, and I was sent down the line of tables to the surgical service. 5 or 6 fellows there checked my documents and asked me to remove some of the clothes I'd thrown over my shoulders. A brute who must have been a wild man of the woods in civilian life gave me a shot in the left pectoral muscle, and I was taken to the hospital hut, where there were beds for the officially disabled. My papers were checked once again, and then, like a miracle, I was shown to a bed, which in fact was only a simple pallet covered with grey cloth. There were no sheets or blankets, but it was nonetheless a genuine bed on a wooden frame, in a dry room protected by a roof. I collapsed onto the bed to relish its comforts. My head was ringing with fever and filled with a host of half-realized impressions. I had grown so used to sleeping on the ground that the degree of well-being a soft, clean mattress can induce struck me with astonishment. The room was full of cots like mine, on which fellows were lying, whimpering and groaning, but I paid no more attention to them than one does to a hotel carpet, which is not entirely to one's liking. I felt almost light-headed with well-being, despite the pain which tore at my entrails. I took off some of my clothes and spread my filthy coat and ground sheet over my body instead of blankets, burying myself in them and in the sense that I had been saved. I lay like that for a long time, trying to control the cramps which knotted my guts. After a while, 2 orderlies arrived, carrying a cumbersome piece of equipment. Without a word of warning, they pulled off my covers. "Turn over, camarade, and let us have a look at your arse. We want to clean out your gut." Before I understood what was happening, they had administered a copious enema and moved on to the next patient, leaving me with some 5 quarts of medicated liquid gurgling painfully in my distended abdomen. I don't know anything about medicine, but an enema has always struck me as a strange treatment for someone who is suffering from excessively frequent evacuations. The fact is that 2 repetitions of this operation enormously increased the misery of the next day and night, which I spent tottering to and from the latrine. This was situated some distance from the infirmary, which meant fighting the strong, icy wind which blew continuously. Any benefits I might have received from this amount of time ostensibly resting in bed were thus reduced to almost nothing. 2 days later, I was pronounced cured and sent back to my company on rubber legs. My company, the one which had been organized as an assault group, was stationed in the immediate vicinity, only 5 or 6 miles from divisional headquarters, in a tiny hamlet which had been half abandoned by the Russian civilian population. Despite my intense joy at reuniting with my friends, all of whom were present, including Ollensheim, my condition remained as precarious as it had been the day before I went to the infirmary. My close friends, Hals, Lenson, and the veteran, made a special effort over me, and did everything they could to help me get well. Above all, they insisted on pouring large quantities of vodka down my throat, which, according to them, was the only reliable remedy for my complaint. However, my precipitate visits to the latrine continued despite these excellent attentions, and the sight of my bloody excrement worried even the veteran, who went with me on these trips in case I fainted. Twice, on the urging of my friends, I tried to re-enter the hospital, which was inundated with wounded from the Battle of Kiev. But my papers, stating that I had been cured, presented an insuperable barrier. I began to look like a tragic protagonist, made of some curious white diaphanous substance, instead of flesh and blood. I no longer left the pallet which had been given to me in one of the izbas. Fortunately, a reduced service requirement allowed me to stay where I was. Several times my friends took guard duty for me and did the other jobs which would ordinarily have been required of me. Everything was going well in the company, which was still commanded by Wesreidau. Unfortunately, we were still in a combat zone, which meant that at any minute we might be sent to some exposed position. Wesreidau knew that I would not be able to function in combat conditions as well as I knew it myself. One evening, about a week after I'd left the infirmary, I became delirious and was completely unaware of a fierce aerial battle which took place directly overhead. "From some points of view, you're really the lucky one," Hals joked. Hals even went to speak to Wesreidau about me. But before he was able to explain himself, Wesrideau stood up and smiled. My boy, we'll be pulling out almost immediately. They're sending us to an occupied zone at least 60 miles farther west. We'll have a certain amount to do there, but even so it will seem like a holiday after this. Tell your sick friend to hang on for another 24 hours and spread the news that we're moving. We'll all be better off. Hals clicked his heels hard enough to shatter his shins and burst out of Wesrideau's quarters like a hurricane. He looked into every butt he passed, shouting out the good news. When he reached us, he shook me from my torpor